In the year 1600, a 25-year-old shoemaker in a small German town looked down a dirty pewter dish sitting on his table. Sunlight hit the metal. For about 15 minutes, he stood there, frozen, staring at the reflection. When he came out of it, he claimed he had just seen the actual architecture of the universe. Not a metaphor, not a feeling. He said he saw the structure of God, nature, good, evil, and creation itself, encoded in the light bouncing off a dish. He had no university training, no formal education past grammar school, and what he wrote down afterward would go on to shape Hegel, influence Isaac Newton, and get him formally banned from ever writing again. His name was Jakob Boehme, and almost nobody has heard of him. Here's the strange part nobody can fully explain. Serious philosophers, scientists, and theologians have spent 400 years arguing about whether what happened to him in that room was a genuine breakthrough in human understanding or something else entirely, and they still haven't settled it. Let's get into who he actually was. 1875, in a farming village near Gorlitz, in what's now the border region between Germany and Poland. His family wasn't poor, but they weren't educated either. His first job, as a child, was a herd boy, watching animals on a hillside. He was eventually sent away to apprentice as a shoemaker, since his family decided he wasn't physically strong enough for farm work. That's it. That's the entire formal preparation this man had for what was about to happen to him. A village childhood, a trade apprenticeship, no seminary, no university, no philosophy training of any kind. By his early 20s, he was a master shoemaker, married, settled in the town of Gorlitz, running his own small shop. By every measure available at the time, his life was ordinary. He went to church, he read his Bible, he worked with leather and thread. Nothing about his biography up to this point suggests anyone destined for what comes next. But something had been building under the surface for years. According to his own later accounts, confirmed by his close friend and biographer Abraham von Frankenberg, Böhme had been going through a period of intense personal anguish. He was wrestling with the existence of evil in a fractured world, wondering how a good God could allow the suffering he saw around him. He'd started attending a small religious study group led by a local pastor named Martin Mahler, a man steeped in older German mystical traditions most ordinary churchgoers had never been exposed to. Böhme absorbed it. And then, in 1600, it happened. Here's the part that's actually documented, not legend. He was sitting in his room in a state of melancholy. His eyes, by chance, caught sunlight reflecting off a pewter dish on the table. That's the entire trigger. Not prayer, not fasting, not a ritual of any kind. An ordinary object catching ordinary light in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. His biographer claims that in 15 minutes, Böhme learned more about the relationship between God and nature than all the universities could teach him in years. Böhme himself later described it differently, and this is the line scholars still quote directly. He said he saw, quote, the being of beings, the bis and the abyss, the eternal generation of the Trinity, the origin and descent of this world, and of all creatures through the divine wisdom. Read that again slowly. A shoemaker, with no training in metaphysics, no exposure to formal theology beyond Sunday sermons, claimed to have directly perceived the origin of the universe and the structure of divinity itself, triggered by looking at a dish. He later said the feeling stayed with him as he walked outside into the fields afterwards. He felt he could see into the innermost essence of nature itself. He compared it to being resurrected from the dead. And here's the detail that should genuinely unsettle you, whether you take this as religious truth or pure psychology. He didn't tell anyone. He went back to making shoes. He kept the experience completely private for 12 years. Why would someone sit on what he believed was the single greatest insight a human being could receive and just not talk about it for over a decade? He chose not to speak of it openly, preferring instead to continue his work and raise a family. He had a shop to run, children to feed. And maybe, just maybe, some part of him understood exactly how dangerous it would be to tell people he'd seen the architecture of God in a dirty dinner plate. Then, in 1610, 10 years later, he had a second inner vision, one that he said gave him an even deeper understanding of the unity of the cosmos, and convinced him he had received an actual vocation from God to write it all down. So in 1612, 12 years after staring at that pewter dish, Boehme finally picked up a pen. He called it Aurora, or in the original German, Morgenrot im Aufgang, the morning redness in the rising of the sun. Here's something almost nobody mentions when they talk about this book. Boehme never actually finished it. He wrote it for himself, never intending it for publication. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should. This wasn't a polished philosophical treatise built to convince an audience. It was a man trying to translate an experienced language was never built to hold, writing for nobody but himself in a torrent that he himself admitted was messy and incomplete. He spent 12 years contemplating what he'd seen before he felt ready to even attempt putting it into words, and when he finally did, it poured out of him in language he acknowledged was imperfect and sometimes confused, but which he said could not hold back. A nobleman named Karl von Ender borrowed the unfinished manuscript, and without Boehme's full intention, had copies made that began circulating. Word got out, and the reaction from religious authorities was almost immediate and brutal. The chief pastor of Gorlitz, a man named Gregorius Richter, called the book blasphemous, said it smelled of shoemaker's pitch and filthy blacking, and claimed there was as many blasphemies as there are lines. Boehme was formally banned from writing. He obeyed that ban for roughly 5 years before quietly starting to write again in secret. Here's the question worth sitting with for a second. If this was just the rambling of an uneducated tradesman, why did it provoke that level of institutional fear? Why ban a shoemaker from writing at all, unless something in those pages actually threatened to move people? So what's actually in it? What did he say he saw? This is where it gets genuinely strange, because Boehme's central idea wasn't really about Bible stories or church doctrine at all. He described the foundation of all reality as something he called the Ungrund, the groundless ground, a pre-cosmic abyss containing nothing but pure potential before any distinction between anything existed at all. From that nothing, he claimed, everything that exists emerges through a kind of internal struggle, a tension between two opposing forces he described as a contracting, fiery darkness and an expanding, luminous light. Creation itself, in his account, comes from the interplay between divine wrath and divine love, two forces that cannot exist without each other. Not good defeating evil, not light replacing dark, both, locked together, generating everything that exists, including you. He believed, and this is the detail that got him in the most theological trouble, that the fall, the moment evil enters the world in Genesis, wasn't a mistake or accident at all. It was a necessary stage in the evolution of the universe itself. Evil isn't a corruption of God's plan. It's a required part of how existence becomes self-aware in the first place. That idea alone, that suffering and darkness aren't a deviation from the divine plan, but an actual engine of it, is the part that should make you pause. Because 400 years later, that's essentially still one of the central, unresolved questions in theology and philosophy. Why does evil exist if God is good? Boehme's answer, dreamed up by an uneducated cobbler staring at a dish, is still being debated in seminaries today. Here's where most people assume the story ends. Eccentric mystic, persecuted by the church, forgotten footnote in religious history. That is not what happened. Boehme's ideas went on to influence Hegel, Schelling, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Carl Jung, Emanuel Swedenborg, and George Fox, the founder of the Quakers. Hegel didn't just casually reference him. Hegel directly called Boehme the first German philosopher. Look at Hegel's most famous contribution to Western thought, the dialectic, the idea that history and reality move forward through the clash of opposing forces resolving into something new. Scholars studying this connection directly argue that Hegel's dialectic is, in many ways, Boehme's mystical drama, rationalized. A shoemaker's vision of light and dark, clocked in eternal struggle, becomes, 2 centuries later, one of the most influential philosophical frameworks in modern history. And then there's a connection almost nobody brings up, because it sounds too strange to be real, except it's documented in serious historical scholarship. Researchers studying the history of science have found clear evidence that Isaac Newton was directly influenced by Boehme's work. One historian specifically points to a striking parallel. Newton's demonstration that white light can be broken apart into a spectrum of colors echoes Boehme's own visionary descriptions of light and darkness as the fundamental components of reality. Sit with that for a second. The same culture that dismissed Boehme as a heretical shoemaker who should be banned from writing, also, through an unbroken chain of intellectual influence, helped shape the man who gave us the laws of physics that still govern your phone, your car, and the orbit of every planet in the solar system. So, here's the actual unresolved question at the center of all of this, and it's not really about religion at all. What happened to Jakob Boehme in that room in 1600? One explanation is the simplest. This was a profound, genuine experience of insight, the kind some psychologists today might categorize loosely along other reports of sudden, overwhelming clarity that occasionally strike people under intense emotional or spiritual strain. And Boehme, lacking any framework to process it, built one from scratch using the only language he had, Lutheran scripture and folk alchemy. The other explanation is the one that Boehme himself would have given you without hesitation, that for 15 minutes, the actual structure of reality became visible to an ordinary, uneducated man, because the structure of reality was never actually hidden in the first place. Boehme's entire philosophy rests on the idea that the divine isn't distant from the material world at all. It's woven into it, present in every ordinary object, including a dirty pewter dish, waiting to be noticed. Neither explanation has won. 400 years of theologians, philosophers, and historians of science have studied this event, and there is still no consensus on what actually happened inside Jakob Boehme's mind that afternoon. But what we do know is that whatever happened produced ideas substantial enough to alter the course of German philosophy. Substantial enough that one of history's most rigorous scientific minds appears to have absorbed pieces of it directly into his own theory of light. An uneducated tradesman, staring at the most mundane object imaginable, produced something that outlasted the empire that banned him, and reshaped how serious thinkers for centuries afterward have tried to explain why anything exists at all. He never claimed to be special. He called himself, in his own words, a poor mouthpiece, someone who saw clearly but struggled to describe what he'd seen. Maybe that's exactly why it's worth taking seriously. He wasn't selling anything. He wasn't trying to found a movement or build a following. He went back to making shoes for 12 years after the most significant experience of his life, and only wrote any of it down because he became convinced, eventually, that he had no choice. A beam of sunlight, a dirty dish, 15 minutes. What's actually looking back at you the next time light hits a surface in your own kitchen?